All right, everyone, I'm going to get started. My name is Joanna Veronkovich. We're going to go through the agenda in the order that it's presented on the website. So we'll start with Jonathan's paper whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Jonathan Stewart. I'm at James Madison University, where from 2011 until last year, I was an assistant professor in the School of Theater and Dance teaching arts administration. And over this last year, I started as the overseeing finance, IT, and assessment for the Division of Student Affairs. So a lot of my job is thinking about what are these things that students should know, think, and do as a part of their experience within higher education. And I got to thinking about those things through my PhD program, focusing on post-secondary analysis. Again, thank you for having me here. The panel discussions yesterday were incredible. I was really thankful to be able to experience those. And particularly that first panel discussion, I think has a little bit of connection to what I'm going to be talking about today. So in my research, I was looking at my own experience. So I studied theater as an undergrad, and I went on to then get a master's in business, and sort of thinking about the differences between those two things as I started going into my PhD program and thinking about student development theory and how students are changing as a result of their education. And the literature that was popping up was concerning, right? So I was seeing a lot of literature around empathy in theater and empathy in student development theory. But empathy and appreciation for empathy was showing to be dropping among college students. And in particular, business students were ranking empathy as the least important leadership quality. And business students make up approximately 19% of our college graduates every year. And again, this isn't to say that business students are bad, that business programs are bad. Just in particular, around this one developmental learning outcome, there are some questions. So again, empathy is this, the ability to take on the perspective of another person, or the ability to feel into something is sort of how I'm defining it in this research. So again, not only to take on the perspective, but this ability to feel into a work of art, or to feel into nature, for example, right? So you can experience a beautiful sunset and have sort of a transformative experience from that. So again, business students are ranking empathy as the least important leadership quality. And then in particular, finance students are shown to be the only major that don't see gains in moral development during their college experience. So pairing that with some of the other literature around how we talk about leaders in society, right? We use a lot of words like drive and vision, while followers actually want leaders to be compassionate, have integrity, and to have empathy. Leaders that lack empathy tend to be less forgiving, and they can lead their organizations into a spiral of negativity. And I think we're seeing a lot of that play out in real time right now. So thinking about ways that we can continue to develop empathy in our adult lives and as students, there were a few different ways, right? So empathy training, so people with low empathy conditions can actually work with professionals and sort of work on developing their empathy. And a lot of that includes effective role-taking in those trainings. But creating art, reading fiction, writing fiction, and effective role-taking are 4 other ways that adults can continue to develop empathy. And all of those things are happening within the theater, right? So right, the entire theatrical process, right? The creation of a performance, right? The designers working behind the scenes that are feeling into a work of art that has been written and showing what that should look like on stage for an audience. Everyone involved in that process is reading fiction. Playwrights are writing fiction. Devised work, they're writing fiction. And of course, effective role-taking with actors and dancers performing particular roles. So some of my research questions were, again, if theater is connected to empathy in this way, and all of these ways of developing empathy in adults are happening in the theater, then what extent does theater engagement influence empathy development among college students? Again, there's a lot of literature out there that gets into some of this qualitative work, but I wasn't seeing much quantitative work in showing that development. So I wanted to sort of dig into that a bit. So some of the literature that I'm framing this again is coming out of a student development framework. So the development of mature interpersonal relationships from Chickering and Reiser. So it's just this toleration and appreciation for differences, and for students to build up a capacity for intimacy. And both of those things require people to be able to empathize. So a lot of the things that are happening in student development theory and all the various theories that are out there typically have empathy as an end goal of that development. So in my model, I'm looking at a simple model for empathy development, looking at confidence, or so people's assuredness in their ability, and their effective identity, or how they understand or express their feelings, that leading to a sense of communal identity. So by first understanding the self and acting sort of in accordance with your inner thoughts and feelings, and the authenticity that comes from that, people tend to develop a sense of communal identity. So they start sort of taking on the perspectives of other people that they're meeting and appreciating the differences of other people that they're meeting. And again, hopefully that's building greater empathy. And there's various ways that those things are happening in college, right? So I don't want to say that theater is the only way to develop empathy, right? There's a natural sort of student development that's happening, and some specific other interventions like community service learning, reflective writing, and other active and integrative experiences that can help develop empathy in college students. In particular, though, with theater, I wanted to look at some of these ways that they've been talked about in the literature. And there's a lot of studies that get into this. So for high school students, for example, there was a study that looked at students showing a higher tolerance for racial differences were the students that were engaged in the theater. There's a study that showed audiences' heartbeats syncing up while they were watching a performance, right? So they're a group of people that were having a physical reaction to the things that they were feeling into, that they were being presented with. And then improvisation has been shown to help develop empathetic communication amongst medical students, right? So this bedside manner type of conversations. And then improvisation was also shown to increase optimism and intimacy within the self and others in these government organizations that were using it for team development and authentic leadership development. And I know Monika is going to talk a lot about improvisation later in the session, so I'm excited to hear more about that. So what I did was I reached out to approximately 600 students, and I focused specifically on theater students to intentionally sort of make sure I was looking at students that were engaged within that process, and then also looking at students that were taking an intro to theater course, right? So they chose to engage in this part of their core class instead of taking other arts-related classes. So I had students that were sort of just taking their first class and experiencing 2 to 3 shows over the course of the semester, to those students that were in their senior year as theater students that were extremely engaged within the process from their freshman year on. Again, what this model is showing is, again, I sent out a survey that was measuring these constructs and variables. And again, this is a simple model for empathy development, effective identity and confidence, leading to a sense of communal identity that then can hope lead to greater empathy. And for every standard deviation increase in communal identity, I saw a 0.38 standard deviation increase in empathy. So this is sort of what we can hope to see from a student's typical college experience. So what this study did was looking at theater engagement above and beyond what's happening down here in this kind of standard simple empathy development model. For every 1 standard deviation increase in theater engagement, I was seeing a 0.29 standard deviation increase in empathy, which was statistically significant. Now, the practical significance of that, of course, is debatable. There's all sorts of conversations that people can have about practical significance and how that plays out. In particular, there's some other limitations of the study. Of course, the fact that it was a single institution, primarily the participants were white women. So as far as generalizability, this isn't something that we can say this is, even if it was more broadly generalizable, of course, this isn't something that we can say, theater causes empathy to happen. It's just a potential additional validity and evidence for a lot of that qualitative research that's been out there over the years. Check my time real quick. So as far as some implications, again, a lot of yesterday's panel has had me thinking a lot more. That first panel in particular, was just incredible. And sort of the way that we were talking about the capitalist framework that we exist in and some of the ways in which it's failed us, particularly in the ways that it's failed the arts. And again, thinking about how 19% of college graduates every year are business students that are going off to be leaders within these organizations, right? They're going off potentially to be politicians. They may be financially influencing politicians. So Mark Bermuda Joseph stated, had this statement that stuck with me with, we have to shift the way that we're thinking about the bottom line, right? And that's not only in society, but in higher education. So what's the bottom line of business programs, right? If the goal at the end of the day is, again, I'm sure there's all sorts of various learning outcomes from business programs that they're reaching for. But often at the end of the day, we hear a lot about people just getting jobs. Right? So the goal is to get the job. The goal is to hopefully maybe as an alumni then give back to the institution. But if we know from the literature that empathy is potentially problematic amongst our business students, what can we do to think about increasing empathy amongst those students? And again, looking at theater as a possible intervention was sort of the goal of this research. A lot of business programs have experiential learning centers. And I'd argue that one of the best experiential learning centers is right across campus in the theater. Right? Theater is a business. So how can we be more intentional about getting those students to participate in that? Right? There's marketing involved, there's finance involved, there's leadership opportunities involved. So being more intentional in that is something that not only business programs can participate in, but theater programs can also advocate for in university leadership if they value empathy as a potential developmental outcome for students going through their programs. I know there's a handful of top business programs that have leadership courses and theater courses as a part of their MBA studies. So a lot of this work is already being done. But not only for again, can't just be on the business programs to be thinking about doing this work. A lot of this kind of has me thinking more about what's the bottom line for the theater programs as well. And are we really focusing on process over products in our education, in our programs? How often are we relying on the talent of the students that we're inviting into our arts programs versus the ability of the program to show meaningful and measurable change in those students? Right? Are we finding ways in our theater and arts programs to remove the financial barriers that keep students from participating in those programs or seeing our performances or seeing our art? So a lot of these questions are sort of kind of within this paper and also still just kind of rattling around in my brain, even more so after yesterday's presentations. So how can we think about, again, what's our goal in terms of what students should know, think, and do? And what are some of these other partnerships that we can think about, not only with business programs, but thinking about theater and drama-based pedagogies for all sorts of other programs around the institution. Right? So literature students collaborating with dramaturgs. You can think about philosophy classes and looking at the ethical dilemmas within a play and using that to sort of help develop an additional capacity for ethical reasoning within programs. Again, continuing with some of these practices that we see with nursing students and medical students and practicing bedside manner with performance students. And there's countless ways to be able to make those interactions. And oftentimes it's about thinking about the silos that we exist in and looking at ways that we can sort of get out of our own bubbles and start interacting with other folks. Some of the future research that I want to focus on, or that I hope others maybe would be interested in focusing on, including and comparing disparate groups, looking at longitudinal studies, looking at actual controlled studies. So here's a group of business students, or here's a group of whatever kind of student, and having specific interventions and looking at what interventions are more successful than others. And are there particular types of theater classes that are more successful? Improvisation in general, and looking at that more specifically. And then, of course, looking at some additional qualitative and mixed method studies to sort of tease out what some of these possible interventions can continue to do for our students. And that is my time. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you, Jonathan. So anybody, feel free to jump in with any questions. Monica, did you have something to say? Oh, let me just go ahead and, there you go.
Sure, I didn't raise the hand yet, but I have thoughts to say. So, you know, it's interesting because the idea is really similar to what I'm pursuing with the jazz model, saying there's so much in what we practice and what we do, these types of skills that should be transferable. But the hard part, you know, the thing that I also always run into is how and what exactly. And, you know, it makes absolute sense. Of course, you know, doing theater and trying to be a different person makes you more empathetic. But what exactly is it going to take one class of taking a theater? Is it putting exercises into whatever others are doing? What is actually the dichotomy? Is it the business students against the theater students, or just anybody who needs to be entrepreneurial? And how is it quantifiable? How much empathy do you get from a class versus an exercise? So that's the part that's so difficult for me too. How do you transfer that thinking, and how does it work exactly? That it's important. I mean, everybody knows it's the absolute essential part of design thinking, you know, that's without empathy, you can't even do that. So every business textbook tells you that. But how do you quantify and how do you transfer and how do you explain that without making this a utility? You know, this is, the theater is good for you, just eat it and you'll be better at something else. So I don't know, reflect on.
I think there's a lot of that that you can see from other types of assessment, right? So a lot of institutions sort of struggle with that, right? They have one program and they think that that's going to solve the problem. And I think a lot of that's happening right now when we're thinking about racial injustice, right? So a lot of universities are like, well, you know, here's another program that we can have, right? And it's not going to work that way. So the sort of that dosing method or having a curricular development for these types of things is important, which is why, again, it can't just be, you know, give the students an opportunity to read a play and maybe they'll be more empathetic. Which is to say, again, with the study, it's the more theater experience a student had, the higher the empathy was showing in this particular survey. So breaking that down in various ways would definitely be an additional question, something that could hopefully be shown. Even, you know, pre-post types of situations with a single class are going to have validity issues in doing that kind of study, depending on the kind of students that are volunteering for that or how you set that study up. Again, hopefully it's the kind of thing that, again, that isn't just happening with business students, but we can think about how the arts can be a part of our institutions more broadly and how students can be participating in that across the board. So maybe, again, it's not just in their major, but they're getting it from a variety of other general education courses, if that's the type of institution that you exist in.
Thanks, Jonathan. Ben, you have your hand up.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, great. Thanks for the presentation, Jonathan. Just a quick comment and then a question. I guess my first comment is just something to reflect upon. I was a finance major myself, and I think you said that finance majors weren't interested in, I don't know whether it was immorality or having some sort of value development as part of the education. That could be the conclusion from the study, but maybe it's just to be mindful about statistics, that it's not entirely the case of every finance student out there. But then again, I'm an improviser, so maybe my own background separates me from a typical finance student. My question is, I'm not an expert in empathy, but I've heard there's different types of empathy, like cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And I'm wondering which one you're working with in your study.
So honestly, it's taking a fairly general look at empathy. Again, there's a lot of studies out there that are sort of getting at again how the brain is processing empathy. So this was more of again looking at the sort of emotional side, the affective identity, the ability to feel into someone or take on the perspective of another person. So again, it is a fairly simple definition and how it's being used in the student development literature. And in terms of the finance statement, again, that's you're absolutely right in terms of it's not every finance student. I know that there's some things that can be alienating about that kind of language, but again, in the literature, in terms of how college is affecting students, they are like collectively as a major, it's not showing those same gains that you're seeing from other majors. So again, it becomes a question of what kind of different things can be inserted into that, and what is it about that that isn't happening? Is it a self-selection type of piece? Is it again a focus on finance in general, and connecting that to some of the discussion that we had yesterday and the way that we're focused on finance in our world and the problems that can create. I'm not sure, but that's sort of just what's out there in the literature on how college affects students.
Yeah, I think it's to follow. It's super interesting what you're pointing out too, because it is. I mean, it can be purely numbers, and if we're talking about perspective taking, then we're really talking about humans, which is pretty different than just numbers. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Aparna.
I was trying to unmute myself when you did that, sorry. My comments were quite similar to Monika's, but I was looking at a couple things. When you say theater intervention, did you sort of look at, are certain kinds of theater interventions more useful when it comes to development of empathy or not? Because you refer to getting business students involved in marketing and financial aspects of theaters. Are those good opportunities? Is there any literature that says that, how empathy might be developed when you engage in those kinds of initiatives pertaining to theater that might be a little more peripheral than actually core production and, involvement and performance? I don't know. I have absolutely no background in the arts per se, so my questions are very naive in that sense, but are there certain kinds of theater-related interventions that tend to be more useful than others? Then you can focus your energies in those areas. So that was kind of one thing I had. I don't know if you had anything on that, but also the notion of, this is clearly a cross-sectional kind of view you've taken, and you allude to sort of more longitudinal studies and need to do that. And I think the notion of sort of single intervention of a particular kind versus sustained interventions of some kinds over the 4-year or whatever college experience they have. So is there anything at all that talks about, those kinds of things? Because where I'm coming from is, I do a lot of research in my own, I teach entrepreneurship, cultural entrepreneurship, and look at the entrepreneurial mindset. And in my own teaching, students who go through our BA in cultural entrepreneurship program, I try to look at the entrepreneurial mindset profile when they enter at the early stages. And then through a variety of coursework towards the end, as they graduate, you look at their entrepreneurial mindset again and the shift that has happened over time through this. So that seems to be, I think it needs sustained intervention, at least in that domain. So maybe I'm curious to know what are your thoughts in terms of sort of, the longitudinal aspects and specifically the kinds of interventions that might be more productive, because we have only so much time when students are learning and only so many people who can know theater, and we can do all these interdisciplinary courses, but there are really practical sort of considerations in here. So can we handpick and identify those areas that can be most useful?
I think one of the things that popped up a lot in the literature when I was looking at it that seems to be looked at a lot and seems to be effective is this idea of improvisation. So improvisational theater, jazz studies, which I know Monika is going to talk about soon. have had a lot of positive benefits that people have looked at more, rather than just saying in general, acting as an empathy boot camp. But what I was looking at, and sort of how I was breaking out my my survey in terms of what I was counting as theater engagement, was based in sort of this classes that people were creating art, reading fiction, writing fiction, and having that effective role taking. So I wasn't saying like every theater class in the program counted in that. I was removing classes if looking at the syllabi and sort of teasing out like this is more of a history class, or if it's a history class, if they aren't reading literature as a part of it, or what have you. I was removing those sorts of things. So in general, that was a part of it. But you're absolutely right that longitudinal studies would and being able to show that sort of pre-post would be the logical next step, and definitely something that I should be looking forward to doing.
I'm letting the conversation go on a little longer just because we only have 2 panelists, but I wanted to also give you just a couple of thoughts for how to kind of narrow in the paper and make it a little bit more focused. So first of all, the idea of leadership and the relation to empathy, I think, is so well documented that I think it's a really excellent framework to start the paper with. And that was mentioned in our panels, for example, yesterday. Leadership, that's the way that we're going to get through this. That's the way that we're going to sustain all of these efforts for change. So it seems to me that you could develop kind of a more narrowly focused framing right from the get-go of the paper, so that it really taps into some of the established empathy literature, and it already does, but even more so. So if you want to talk to, for example, people in business, leadership is a great concept to tap into right from the get-go. So that's one recommendation I would have for the paper. The other just small point I made was, so I have a theater background, 25 years I was in theater, and interestingly, I'm out of it now, but at the same time, I still go back to my theater days and I think about all of the exercises we did. And sometimes, I'm at a party and I'll introduce those exercises to some of my friends and everybody's like, there's no way I'm going to do this, right? So it makes me think that there's also this point to bring up in the paper, which is the aversion to doing something different, right? So if you're a business student or a finance student and you've signed up to take a particular curriculum, then the idea that you're going to be doing some type of theater exercise is actually kind of awkward and uncomfortable for some people. And so how do business schools in particular, and Fortune 500 companies who bring in actors, and I know that this happens, to train their leaders, like how do they deal with that general aversion? Like think about yourself at a conference when you're asked to do an icebreaker. Sometimes it just doesn't go well, right? And then I guess what the whole time I've been watching your presentation and reading the paper is I think about how can you ramp up your experimental results? And in other words, like how can you make these more experimental? And I think that will help give the results more validity. And we've been doing a couple of experiments here on campus. And so I've just started to learn how to run experiments on campus. And it's so difficult, but it's actually, once you get into it, it's, there's a protocol you follow and you can do it. And so I thought, first of all, you don't have to do anything pre and post. Obviously that's great if you can, but if you don't have that time, or if you want to do something just quickly to sort of follow up, you can just think about how to sample, right? So you can think about what's the sampling frame, who am I going to be asking, what's my treatment and control group, and sample so that you at least have some sort of control group. And so I think that could really help the validity of the findings a lot. And then honestly, I think that that's a big part of what you could do. It's really about thinking about, how do you filter out the people who have these preconditions for already being empathetic or developing empathy from out of the group of the people who don't have those preconditions. And I know lots of business schools, for example, ours on campus have a list of students student email addresses that all of the faculty use to sample from for experiments. So their students in undergrad are constantly going through experiments from their faculty. That's like a resource for the faculty. Definitely getting lists from, you can do those things on campus, and it's sort of a nice controlled environment to do. So, and it wouldn't really take a lot of time. It'd be a matter of getting the sampling frame and being able to sample and then send out the survey again. So I don't know. So I guess those were my two big comments. It's like, how can you refocus to make it the framework just a little bit more targeted right from the get-go? And then how can you build on the experiment so that you at least have some treatment and control group going? So that's all I had. Do you want to respond to any of that?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I appreciate the comments about the framework. That was sort of part of the struggle when I was writing it from the get-go, is sort of serving multiple masters in my program in terms of it being a leadership program, but the focus being on student development theory. So trying to find ways and using multiple frameworks. So a lot of what I talked about is authentic leadership development and sort of how that builds into some of this as well, which I didn't do as much in a 15-minute presentation, but it is another one of the frameworks that I focus on with the paper. But I agree, it could be more explicit up front. And then, yeah, in terms of sampling, that is a struggle. Again, my hope was to be able to look at these students that are all engaged in theater in some way and seeing, even amongst those students, is there a change based on the amount that they had? Of course, that brings up questions of, is that because of they're further along in that education, which is going to naturally, ideally develop that empathy additionally. Another connection sort of that worked out in the literature, or to sort of the literature provided some evidence of it, and then it showed in here, was there wasn't actually a difference between theater students and any other majors in their empathy development. But the only statistically significant difference between majors was between theater majors and business majors. So that was interesting things that popped up from this. It was like, that makes sense based on everything else that's been written about.
And that really can help inform the next round of what you do. Because I think with all of this type of work, it's really replication that starts to finally get at what you're trying, at the question that you're trying to answer. So that's good. Well, great. Thank you, Jonathan. We will go ahead and move on to our next presenter. Again, I'm kind of being a little loosey-goosey here with the format, just because we only have two presenters in this morning session. So next up, we have Monika. And so I think, Casey, if you could transfer. Good. So Monika now has co-host status, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. You can see it. You can hear me. All good.
Yep.
All right. So my study is, I'm a jazz musician by trade. I'm deeply into the art form daily, and something that I believe, I also teach arts entrepreneurship courses. So what I deeply believe on is that you can train your brain in a specific way to improvise, which is an essential skill again for entrepreneurship, for solutions. And so I did several things. One thing is I worked on a model to see what's going on in a jazz jam session. We had large survey, we had interviews, and several years ago extracted the factors. I'll go through those. And then for this specific case, I want to use 3 models that happen to be great jazz musicians, which means they trained their brains in specific ways, but actually were incredible entrepreneurs. So I want to showcase that relationship of 3 that did that. And how do I go to the next one here? There we go. So this whole jazz model comes up in the literature since more than 20 years, over and over, and in a lot of different ways. So the general themes that come up in the literature are these. Number one, this need to develop improvisational capacities to generate ideas. That's absolutely agreed on, because ideas come out of putting things together in new ways. And you have to be willing to take those risks, and you have to take that step in the unknown. The other theme that keeps coming up, that is creativity, which is essential to organizational performance, any way to exploit new ideas in different ways. The third theme that comes up in the literature is that improvisation is an essential skill to cope with situations where you have change, where you have turbulence. You have to come up with a solution very quickly. So that's when you need that skill. And the fourth theme that keeps coming up is that there's evidence that the way the brain works when you improvise is different from when you do a task, a predetermined task. And there's, of course, the studies with the brain scans that show how all the activity moves to the prefrontal cortex the moment you improvise, and all the little voices that say, maybe you shouldn't, maybe you couldn't, you just turn that off. So the evidence being that there's a way to train that process and make you better at it. And the model that I'm working on, that we developed in 2014, are these 7 factors that we extracted from looking at jam sessions, interviewing people's surveys. And one, of course, you got to be as good as you can. The more knowledge you bring to the table, the better the results. Number 2, that yes, you can practice, train your brain to get better at improvising. Number 3, something that's in that model that is there since about 100 years, it works and it's used a lot all the time, is there is a natural distribution of having some mentors and role models and passing on the information through that. Number 4 is the idea that the art form itself is this democracy and collaboration. You have a person that steps up front, expresses their solo, their voice, and everybody else immediately goes in support position, and there's a natural switch off. And when it works great, it's when everybody gets this equal opportunity. Then there is this idea that you have leaders and sidemen in this configuration. People take on specific roles according to what's needed, and you don't overlap. It makes sense. Then, of course, all the surrounding factors. Where does this take place? What kind of outside factors are there in support? And then the last thing, this continuous evaluation that goes on in these types of situations. You know, something goes wrong, we'll adjust a little bit. This one needs to get off the bandstand, or if Charlie Parker goes on too long because he can't do it, we'll throw a cymbal at him and get him off that stage. Whatever it takes. So this case study looks at these 3 individuals, and those of you have some idea about jazz probably are aware of them. They call them the ABCs. Jamie Aebersold is in the middle. He is still with us. He has started this idea of play-along tracks and built the biggest publishing empire there is in jazz, and also the idea of the summer workshops that's still running after 48 years. So one of the biggest entrepreneurs there are. David Baker and Jerry Coker being at the forefront of developing this blueprint, how jazz is taught, the ultimate jazz curriculum that at that time was needed and was not available. So those are the 3. This is one of the summer workshops in Denmark where you see them years ago. They've been working together every summer as long as they could. And one interesting fact, since we're based in Indiana. All three of those were at Indiana University at some point at the same time. They were all from Indiana. They all still teach their workshop here. So there's a strong connection. And where the conference is right now around the corner, this is where the Walker Theater is. This is where these markers are. So there's a really strong local connection here too. So what I did for this case study is I took those 7 factors and exemplified that with their entrepreneurial activity. So the important thing to realize here is I'm not trying to show that they are great jazz musicians, or, you know, it's not about the entrepreneurship in jazz. It's about their entrepreneurial capacities that they displayed, which I believe are based coming out of their training in the jazz idiom, to show how their training in improvisation led them to be these great entrepreneurs. So to show the competence, they are all some of the most competent people there are who could attempt what they did. There's 2 NEA jazz masters among them. They played with the most important groups at that time. I mean, there's no doubt that there are leaders in the field. The idea to practice improvisation, to have that ability. So Jamie Ebersold, when he came up with this concept of creating these play-alongs, this was late 60s at a time where this was a very foreign concept and there was no interest whatsoever in it. He drove around in the country with the play-alongs. This was number 1, it was LP at that time, in the trunk. And it took him until 72, I believe he said, when he started to make a penny on it. I mean, this whole task of believing in it against all resistance, drive from store to store and offering this. So he definitely displayed this ability of whatever it takes, I'm going to figure out a way, my mind can do it. Then the third factor of establishing the mentorship and the role models, I mean, this is one of the pictures at their summer workshops. Jamie Ebersold actually claims that through his first lesson with David Baker, the whole idea that anyone can improvise came out of it, out of what he did. And that was a large tribute. So they all were mentors to each other, and these are some of the leaders there. The fourth factor, the idea of democracy and collaboration. So just like in a jazz group, switching off and letting everybody solo, every summer at the camp, they would get together and discuss their developments, what they're working on, get feedback from each other, and make it better. They had this continuous way of getting together, tossing it off from each other, the idea, and we're always in touch. The idea of leaders and sidemen, the leadership that we saw in what David Baker did. To start a jazz program at the time he did was a huge step. There was no model whatsoever. So he was able, he put an article out earlier where he had everything lined out, and he absolutely took that leadership role and putting something in place that there was no blueprint for it and there was no idea. And actually, when he came to IU and proposed the program, he told me in interviews, faculty told him there will not over their dead body will this go into the curriculum, and it did it a year later. The idea of community support, you know, again, going back to how they were supported in their endeavors and grew up. The Indiana Avenue community that I mentioned right around the corner of IUPUI had this high school that was all Black. It was actually a bad thing that the city of Indianapolis did by putting all their kids in one school, and it turned out a great thing because the support they got was immense. And also, Indiana is the crossroads of America, meaning every touring group has to come through there. So this constant seeing the best of the best and being around and influenced actually created a group of the leading jazz musicians at that time. So David Baker was part of the supporting community that helped him get to the level he got to. You know, some of the people that came out of that time, if you know jazz names, Slide Hampton, Wes Montgomery, Freddie Hubbard, J.J. Johnson, they all grew up on that block just around IUPUI. And the last factor, this continuous evaluation system. So when Jerry Coker developed his curriculum, he was at the University in Miami. And they had to also start from scratch. There was no blueprint. He had to come up with what should we do? How can we do that? And so in one of the interviews, he explained to me how their process, how they worked on it. So for 5 years, they would try their courses, ask what should we do? What should we do better? And every year they got the suggestions, they incorporated it until eventually they got the comments up. Now this is working. But this is just one example of how diligent they were in implementing their ideas and their suggestions. So in terms of what this leads in discussion, how this might be transferable, so what I strongly believe in is that this model of getting together in a group similar to a jam session, there is so much of blueprint and toolbox for developing curriculum group creativity. And I've actually been teaching this idea of group creativity for quite a while now at several universities. Then in the concept of effectual entrepreneurship, it depends so much on cultivating this capacity, because the way it works, the way Saraswati found that entrepreneurs work is by taking what they have, taking the materials. It's often compared to cooking. You know, you have stuff in the fridge and you'll take what you have and you come up with something out of that, but you're not using a recipe, going out and taking what you should be buying for it. So, and I think this is really parallel, Jonathan, to what you're seeing with the business students, maybe being different, because typically the way this is the strategy, how it's taught in business school, it's this causal approach, you know, this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. So that's the difference. Improvisational capacity can be trained. I think that's crucial. The factors and resources around it are crucial. Where are you? What support do you have? How can we help from other ways, money, ways to develop your skills? And so similar to Jonathan, to what you said, what's tricky is how do you measure? There are different levels of improvisation. You can just, you know, come up with a new pattern, or you can go completely free and it's similar in everything else. And what are possible differences in arts versus entrepreneurial improvisations? So those are some of the questions. And I'd love to get feedback, because the hardest part is to convince people that this works. Everybody goes, well, that's cute, you know, new jazz musician, you have this thing, but it's not what we do and it's not for us. And just like Joanna said, you know, if you try it at a party and you'll make somebody improvise, they go, oh, just leave me alone, I don't want to do this, right? So this combination, how can we do this to say, here are some really great tools, ways to train your brain, take it, implement it. So I'm open for questions and ideas and suggestions.
Thank you, Monika. So anyone can jump in with questions, either raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Don't be shy. So Monika, do you want to talk a little bit more about the current survey that you have listed here? Because you didn't say anything about that.
Well, so I'm convinced that, in this whole disaster that we are, I started a CD release tour early March. The CD is number 6 on the jazz charts right now, but we had to turn around in the middle. All my fellow jazz musicians lost everything. But I think based on this whole idea of improvisational capacities, I think there's a lot of cues in the jazz community right now on solutions because of the way those brains work. So I'm have this survey open. It's specifically for jazz musicians. If you know any, please share and get it out. And I'm trying to gauge what are people doing and what can we see that might give us some cues, because I think especially in this improvisational community, there's a lot going on.
Tal.
Hey, thank you. Okay, thank you, Monika. It was so very interesting, and I learned a lot about the history of these people that their names are so well known in the jazz world, and I didn't know the story behind this. It's so interesting. And I find your argument really very convincing about the similarities and parallelism between what happens in a jam session and the skill which are beneficial for an entrepreneur in everything. But still that make me think, so if these skills are so transferable as it really seems, so why do still so many great jazz musicians find it so hard to really succeed financially and really be entrepreneurs? You're looking like at three big winners, like three really big names that are well known because they succeeded so much and made such a wonderful careers. But what with all these other musicians behind the scene? And it made me think, just thinking of the fact that these three figures are, you talked about leaders and sidemen. These three people were, as musicians, leaders, the 2 saxophonists and 1 trombone players, maybe the skills of rhythm section players like me, bassists, drummers. Maybe are a bit different. So if you can say something about this, if you have thought about this or have some findings.
I do. So, something to realize is, so yes, there's this mindset, the way jazz musicians train, but there's also the economics around the jazz world, which of course, influence a lot on how successful things get. And unfortunately, this is an art form that completely fell through the cracks. You had classical music be very successful at developing a nonprofit system that supports, with boards and everything. Jazz musician used to be the pop music for profit that made money because it was popular, and then pop music came and took that place of creating income. So jazz music did not have that support system of the nonprofit. Of course, it's a music that's rooted in Black arts. We talked about racism. We see what's going on. So that's one of the big reasons that despite having this art form, this process, these things that work, there's a socio-economic structure that really only very few can break through. So I would think a lot of what you're seeing and why jazz musicians seem to be a struggling population is based on that, which actually supports the idea how important the context is and how important in what ways you work. And are bassists and drummers always sidemen? It depends. You're trained more, your role is more like that, but there's other examples too. But you're right, there's some relationship in what function you have in the band and what you develop for that.
Aparna.
Yeah. So I think on that note, I think one way to think of this might be that improvisation is, I don't know if it is like a necessary skills, but it certainly determines your entrepreneurial performance. But it may not be like a sufficient or sort of a, it has an effect on being entrepreneurial, but there are many other factors that actually influence your ability to be entrepreneurial or entrepreneurial performance. So that kind of thought came to my mind to your question there, Dan. Also, I think in terms of improvisation, there's clearly a lot of literature in the entrepreneurship world that talks about, improvisation is so crucial, and measurements and instruments to see how well one performs on improvisation. There's a scale for improvisation in the entrepreneurial context. So I think I don't know how you are kind of looking at, sort of measuring improvisation. I'll be interested in knowing more about that, how you're thinking about that. Because I think the scale that I've seen has absolutely no bearing with, any particular domain as such. It is not in the music field. I'd used that sometime back. I don't remember the authors right now, but I'm curious to see if there is sort of a new way of looking at improvisation because of the context of jazz and, how improvisation happens over there. But I think you talked about democracy, collaboration, leaders, sidemen. Maybe I missed the point when you were explaining, because I was listening to this for the first time. I've not read the paper. So can you talk a bit about how do you relate that with entrepreneurship?
So the idea of democracy, so that's specifically on the process of groups working together to come up with new solutions, to come up with new ideas, on the idea that in a jam session, in a jazz group, you are trained naturally to have this give and take equally. So, and when one person solos, raises their voice, says something, everybody else doesn't go, oh no, we can't do that, it's not possible, but they have to do whatever they can to make that person sound good, because they're part of that whole sound that comes out, and if they don't support, everybody will be affected. So that's the idea or the principle that is transferable. How do you work in a group if you don't give everybody equal space, if you don't make sure everybody's in support of this common goal? You might not be as effective as possible.
Okay. So
and the idea of leaders and sidemen is taking on specific roles. So one example is Pixar Studios. When it started, you had George Lucas, who puts the money in, you have Steve Jobs, who just has the ideas, and then you have the best graphic designers. So each one has a specific role and does this role well. But if George Lucas would have tried to work on the graphic design and give some input and say you should do it that way, would probably not be the greatest idea, because he's not an expert in that. So it's just the idea that everybody should find the best role that you can have in a group setting like that to make it more effective, and not try to take on other things that might not be as effective. It doesn't mean it can change when you go into a different group setting and you take on a different role, but it's important to find what that role is. Mm-hmm. And I love the improvisation scale. If you could send me or share some of that, I would love to see that and see how I can, work on that and put that together.
Sure. I can do that, yeah.
Thanks, Aparna. Jonathan, you should be able to unmute yourself now. We've changed it.
There we go. I just wanted to say I love the framework, and just another avenue that you could look at with that framework is getting into change theory within sort of the leadership framework and how organizations can affect change. Because your framework has some things in common with some of that. And I think there's some interesting parallels there that you could explore if you wanted to at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And then also just, again, thinking about improvisation and sort of ways to make people do that. And it's kind of getting back to the idea of making people uncomfortable. And some of the work that I've done has been with some of these students that don't, that aren't, theater students that aren't comfortable. So from a theatrical standpoint, is sort of taking the comedy out of it, or that need to be something, or the need to be funny, which is so often associated with theatrical improvisation. And one of the more successful experiences I've had was working with biology students to talk about their thesis using improvisation. So it was, how can you explain your thesis statements in these, a variety of different contexts, just to get them sort of out of their head and sort of into a different place, and whether or not that happens for an audience or if it happens just in a one-on-one session. And I know that happens with entrepreneurship and sort of the idea of sales pitches and things like that. It's a lot of the same way, but pulling them sort of out of their comfort zone and getting them thinking about presenting in a completely new light is often successful, even for people that don't feel comfortable sort of performing.
Right. Yeah, that's, I try to frame my entrepreneurship classes like each one has some activities where you have to do something that you're not comfortable with. And I just want to show them, over the course of having to do that all the time, that after a while you go, okay, well, whatever, that you can train those things. That and the idea of journaling and writing something or observing something, doing something every day to get better at it. But yeah, thank you. That organizational, the change theory, if you have any tips and links for me on that, I'd love that too.
Thank you, Jonathan. Any last questions for Monika? Or comments? Great. So we don't have any breaks scheduled in the day, so maybe you want to take advantage of this 10-minute break before the next sessions. Oh, I'm sorry. We have a little bit. It's until 10:45. We do have breaks scheduled. Okay. So that being said, if you want to stick around here and chat, that's fine. Go over to track A if you'd like to catch the last paper there. I'd encourage you to do that too. I'm going to switch rooms eventually with Doug for this next session. Thank you, everybody. That was wonderful. Great discussion.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Monika. Thanks, Jonathan, for your presentations.